Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight's story is Anne of Green Gables, Episode 13, A Queen's Girl. Before we begin, if these stories bring you comfort, I'd love for you to subscribe so you can always find your way back whenever you need a quiet place to rest. And now, let's begin. With the closing days of June came the quiet ending of one chapter of Anne Shirley's life. The fields around Avonlea had ripened into the deep green fullness of early summer. Clover blossomed alongside the road, swallows skimmed low across the meadows, and the warm afternoon breeze carried the fragrance of hay and wild roses through the open schoolhouse windows. For the older pupils of Avonlea School, however, the beauty of the day was touched with sadness. Their last afternoon with Miss Stacy had come to an end. Books were gathered. Slates were tucked beneath eager young arms. Desks that had been filled with lessons, laughter, and whispered conversations all winter now stood empty once again. No one seemed eager to leave. Small groups lingered beneath the maple trees outside while Miss Stacy stood at the doorway, saying a few quiet words to each pupil before they went their separate ways. When Anne's turn came, Miss Stacy took both her hands. "You've worked so faithfully this year, Anne," she said warmly. "Remember what I've told you. Trust yourself and don't spoil your good work by worrying." "I'll try," Anne answered, though her voice trembled a little. Miss Stacy smiled. "I know you will." Only then did Anne realize how difficult it truly was to say goodbye. She hurried away before the tears could betray her. Diana was waiting beneath the maples. Neither girl spoke for several moments. They simply turned toward home together. By the time they reached Spruce Hill, both had cried enough that their handkerchiefs were of very little use. At the foot of the hill, Diana looked back. The little white schoolhouse rested peacefully among the trees, its windows glowing softly in the late afternoon sunshine. "It really feels as though everything is ending," she whispered. Anne followed her gaze. "It does." She smiled sadly. "If I pass the entrance, I suppose I've gone to that dear old school for the last time. Oh, it won't be the same without you. Nor without Miss Stacy. And perhaps Jane and Ruby won't come back either." Anne slipped an arm through Diana's. "We've had such happy years. The happiest." For a little while they walked without speaking. The road wound gently between fields where the hay was nearly ready for cutting. A meadowlark called somewhere beyond the pasture. The world looked exactly as it always had. Only they themselves had changed. Anne sighed. "I almost wish the examinations were over." "Oh, but you've done so well all year, Anne." "Oh, Miss Stacy's examinations never frightened me." She laughed softly. "But these are the real entrance examinations." Her smile faded. "Sometimes I feel quite certain I'll pass. And sometimes I feel perfectly convinced I'll fail." Diana looked surprised. "You? I'm afraid my courage changes every few hours." She smiled at herself. "And then there's my examination number." "Well, what is it?" 13, Diana laughed. "You don't really believe that's unlucky." "I know perfectly well it isn't," Anne laughed. "At least I know it oughtn't matter." She paused. "But I do wish it had been 12, or 14, or almost anything else." The girls laughed together, and somehow the road seemed a little less heavy afterward. "I wish I were going with you," Diana said. "So do I. But Miss Stacy has forbidden all the cramming." "Really?" Anne nodded. She says we are not to open a single lesson book before the examinations. Not one. Not one. Anne smiled. She says we've done all the studying we can do. Now we're to walk, sleep well, enjoy ourselves as much as possible, and trust what we've learned. That sounds very sensible. It does, Anne laughed. Though, I suspect it will be much easier to admire such advice than to follow it. They had reached the place where their roads divided. My Aunt Josephine will be so glad to have you at Beechwood, Diana said. I know, Anne smiled. It was so kind of her to invite me. And you'll write the very first evening. I'll be watching for the postman. I knew you would. The girls embraced before going their separate ways. The following Monday morning, Matthew drove Anne to town beneath a bright June sky. Neither spoke very much. Sometimes silence carried love more faithfully than words could ever. Beechwood welcomed Anne with its broad verandas, cool, shaded rooms, and Aunt Josephine's gracious hospitality. Everything was comfortable. Everything was peaceful. Yet beneath it all lay tomorrow. Tomorrow the entrance examinations would begin. That evening, before retiring, Anne unfolded a sheet of stationery and dipped her pen into the ink. She had promised Diana a letter, and there was already so much to tell. The first evening at Beechwood passed more quietly than Anne had expected. After the excitement of arriving, Aunt Josephine insisted that she put every thought of the examinations aside until morning. You shall not open a single school book while you're here, she declared firmly. Miss Stacy has already instructed you wisely, and I refuse to interfere. Anne laughed. I believe everyone has entered into a conspiracy to keep me from studying. It's a very sensible conspiracy. Supper was served upon the broad veranda overlooking the beautiful lawns. The evening air carried the scent of flowering shrubs, while somewhere beyond the trees a thrush sang the last notes of the day. Beechwood possessed a calm unlike Green Gables. It was elegant without being grand, quiet without ever feeling lonely. Yet Anne found herself thinking more than once of the familiar kitchen at home, where Matthew would now be finishing the evening chores and Marilla would already be clearing the supper table. After the lamps were lit, Anne carried her writing case to a small table beside the open window. She had promised Diana a letter. Drawing a fresh sheet of paper toward her, she dipped her pen into the ink. My dearest Diana, here I am at Beechwood at last, and tomorrow morning the dreadful examinations begin. I have tried faithfully not to think about them all evening, but they keep slipping into my mind when I least expect them. Miss Stacy would be very disappointed in me. Aunt Josephine has been wonderfully kind. She declares I am not to look at one single lesson tonight, and she has watched me so carefully that I couldn't possibly disobey even if I wished to. This morning we all gathered at the academy. Nearly everyone looked frightened. Moody Spurgeon walked up and down repeating the multiplication table under his breath as though it were a prayer. Poor Moody. I don't believe he heard a single word anyone said to him. Jane, she looked very pale. Ruby confessed she had scarcely slept all night. And Josie Pye tried to appear perfectly unconcerned, which naturally convinced no one. Gilbert looked astonishingly calm. I don't know whether he truly felt so confident or merely wished everyone to think he did. When the English examination papers were placed before us, my heart gave one terrible leap. For one dreadful moment I thought I had forgotten everything that I had ever learned. Then I read the first question and discovered that I actually knew the answer. And then after that, I began to breathe again. History was much kinder to me than I expected. Grammar, too. But tomorrow comes geometry. I confess I approach it with less enthusiasm than any Christian ought to display. If Euclid ever intended to comfort schoolgirls, he certainly concealed his intentions very successfully. After today's examination, we all went for ice cream together. Imagine such a thing. It seemed impossible to spend the morning trembling over examination papers and the afternoon eating strawberry ice cream beneath the trees. Poor Ruby was convinced she had failed everything. Poor Moody was equally certain he had forgotten his own name halfway through the history paper. I did my best to encourage them both, although I cannot honestly say I felt especially courageous myself. Dear Diana, I do wish you were here. Everything feels a little strange without you beside me. Whenever anything amusing happens, I find myself turning to tell you before remembering you are 30 miles away. Still, I have your friendship with me even here. That is one of the pleasant things about true friends. Distance doesn't seem quite able to separate them. Now, I must close. Tomorrow's geometry awaits me. Please think hopeful thoughts for me. Your loving Anne. Anne smiled as she folded the letter. Outside, the warm June evening settled peacefully over Beechwood. Tomorrow would bring another examination, another opportunity to worry. But tonight, the letter was written. Her promise to Diana had been kept, and somehow that made the world feel a little more like home. The examinations came and went more quickly than Anne had expected. One by one, the papers were finished. English, history, grammar, geography, even geometry, which had haunted her imagination for weeks beforehand, finally became nothing more than another completed examination folded neatly upon the examiner's desk. When the last paper had been collected, the entire company of weary students poured out into the warm June sunshine with expressions that ranged from relief to complete bewilderment. No one seemed quite certain how he or she had performed. Ruby Gillis declared that she had certainly failed history. Moody Spurgeon was convinced he had made a dreadful mistake in arithmetic. Jane Andrews admitted that she could scarcely remember a single answer she had written. Anne listened to them all with a sympathetic smile. She understood exactly how they felt. The examinations were over. Nothing could be changed now. All that remained was waiting. Before leaving town, Anne spent one last pleasant evening at Beechwood with Aunt Josephine. The gracious old house felt wonderfully restful after the strain of the previous days. They sat together upon the veranda while the evening breeze wandered gently through the great elm trees, speaking of books, gardens, and pleasant memories instead of examinations. Anne found the conversation wonderfully soothing. For a little while, she almost succeeded in forgetting the past list altogether. The following morning, Matthew came to bring her home. The familiar drive back to Green Gables seemed shorter than ever before. How comforting it was to see the white farmhouse waiting among its orchards. How pleasant it felt to step once more into the cool kitchen where Marilla stood preparing dinner. "Well," Marilla said quietly, "it's good to have you home again." "It's even better to be here," Anne smiled. "I don't believe any place in the world feels quite so much like home." Life quickly settled into its ordinary summer rhythm once more. The hayfields waited to be cut. The gardens demanded constant attention. Diana came nearly every afternoon. Outwardly, everything seemed exactly as it always had. Only, Anne's thoughts refused to become ordinary again. Every morning she wondered whether the newspaper had arrived. Every afternoon she found herself listening for footsteps upon the lane. Every evening she reminded herself that worrying accomplished absolutely nothing. Then she worried anyway. Matthew noticed. More than once he looked across the supper table with quiet concern. "You aren't eating much these days, Anne." Anne smiled bravely. "I suppose I'm living upon examination nerves. I'd rather see you living upon Marilla's biscuits." Anne laughed. "I believe I should rather prefer that too." But even laughter could not entirely banish the waiting. Mrs. Rachel Lynde stopped by one afternoon and found Anne sitting beneath the Snow Queen cherry tree with a book lying unopened in her lap. "Still waiting?" "I'm trying not to." Mrs. Lynde nodded knowingly. "I've always said those examination boards take far too long." She settled herself comfortably. "And if they don't pass every one of Miss Stacy's scholars, it'll be a disgrace." Anne smiled. "I'm afraid they won't consult either of us before deciding." "No," Miss Lynde answered briskly. "But they ought to." The days slipped by quietly. Sometimes Anne persuaded herself she had certainly passed. An hour later she became equally convinced she had failed. Then she would remember one answer that she had forgotten, only to discover the next morning that she had remembered it correctly after all. It seemed impossible for the mind to remain settled. One warm evening, after supper, Anne carried a chair to the east gable window. Outside, the fields glowed softly beneath the last light of day. The brook wandered peacefully through the pasture, and far away she could see the white bridge crossing the little stream below the Berry farm. The beauty of the evening gradually quieted her restless thoughts. Perhaps, just perhaps, she would spend one entire hour without thinking of examinations. Then, all at once, movement caught her eye. Someone was running across the bridge, running as fast as she could. Anne leaned forward. The figure came nearer. Even at a distance, she recognized it was Diana's straw hat. In one hand, she held something white that fluttered wildly as she ran. A newspaper. Anne sprang to her feet. Her heart gave one great leap. The pass list had come. Anne was halfway down the stairs before Diana reached the front gate. She scarcely remembered crossing the hallway or opening the door. Only moments before, the evening had been perfectly still. Now, her heart seemed louder than every sound around her. Diana came flying up the lane, flushed from running, the newspaper clutched tightly in one hand. "Oh, Anne!" She could scarcely catch her breath. "It's here!" Anne stopped short. For one impossible moment, she could not make herself move. The newspaper. It had finally come. Diana reached her at last, laughing and panting all at once. "Father brought it from Bright River." She thrust the folded paper toward Anne. "I looked. I couldn't help looking." Anne drew back a little. "I can't." "You must." "I truly can't." For all the long weeks she had imagined this moment, she found herself utterly unable to unfold the paper. Suppose her name was not there. Suppose everyone she loved had hoped for too much. Diana understood at once. Her own smile softened. "Then I'll tell you." She looked down at the newspaper again, though she already knew every word by heart. "Anne Shirley." She paused, just long enough to make Anne catch her breath. "You passed." Anne closed her eyes. A wave of thankfulness swept over her so suddenly that for a moment she couldn't speak. "You've passed," Diana repeated, laughing now. "And not only passed," she caught both of Anne's hands. "You came first." Anne stared at her. "What?" "You and Gilbert Blythe are tied for the highest standing on the whole Prince Edward Island list." For one perfectly still moment, neither girl spoke. Then Anne gave a little cry that was half laughter and half disbelief. "Oh, Diana, I knew you could do it. I never dared hope. You did." Anne laughed through sudden tears. "Perhaps a very tiny little bit." Together, they hurried toward the house. Matthew had already stepped out onto the porch. He looked from Anne to Diana and then to the newspaper folded beneath Diana's arm. He needed no explanation. Anne ran to him. "Oh, Matthew!" She threw both arms around him. "I've passed." Matthew patted her shoulder awkwardly. "I knew you would." His voice was quiet, but his eyes shone with unmistakable pride. "And?" Anne laughed. "I've tied with Gilbert Blythe for first place." Matthew smiled the slow, gentle smile that Anne loved better than almost any words. "I always knew you were clever." Marilla had come to the doorway by then. "What is all this excitement?" Anne turned toward her. "I've passed, Marilla." Marilla took the newspaper and adjusted her spectacles. She read the list carefully. Then she read the first names again. Anne Shirley, Gilbert Blythe, equal honors. She lowered the paper. "Well," there was a little pause. "You've done very well, Anne." Anyone who did not know Marilla might have thought the words ordinary. Anne knew better. She crossed the porch and kissed Marilla warmly. "I hoped you would be pleased." "Pleased?" Marilla's eyes softened. "I'm proud of you." The words were spoken quietly, but Anne thought she had never heard anything more wonderful. Before long, the news had spread through Avonlea. Mrs. Rachel Lynde arrived before sunset, full of congratulations and opinions in equal measure. "I always said Miss Stacy's class would do credit to Avonlea," she declared. "And tying with Gilbert Blythe," she nodded approvingly. "John Blythe would have been proud of that boy." Then she turned toward Anne. "And I suppose we'll have to admit you've done remarkably well yourself." Anne laughed. "I shall treasure that compliment forever, Mrs. Lynde." "You may." Mrs. Lynde smiled despite herself. "You've earned it." That evening, after the visitors had gone home and quiet settled once more over Green Gables, Anne wandered out beneath the Snow Queen cherry tree. The last light lingered softly across the fields. The brook sang its familiar evening song, and everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Yet somehow, everything had changed. The road that stretched beyond Green Gables no longer seemed quite so mysterious. It had opened a little wider, and somewhere beyond its next bend, another chapter of Anne Shirley's life was waiting to begin. Several weeks after the entrance results had brought such excitement to Green Gables, another important event began stirring in Avonlea. A grand concert was to be held at the White Sands Hotel in the aid of the Charlottetown Hospital. The hotel guest would provide several music selections, and talented performers from surrounding districts had all been invited to take part. Anne Shirley had been asked to recite. From the moment the invitation arrived, Anne looked forward to the evening with a mixture of delight and nervous anticipation. "To think of reciting before all those fashionable people," she told Diana. "People who have traveled and attended concerts in great cities and heard celebrated singers. It is enough to make a person feel very insignificant." "You've recited before," Diana reminded her. "Yes, but never at the White Sands Hotel." Anne spoke the name with suitable gravity. "That makes an enormous difference." The evening of the concert arrived warm and clear. Anne, dressed carefully in the beautiful white organdy gown Matthew had bought for her. Its soft folds felt lightly around her, and the delicate frills at the neck and the sleeves gave it exactly the fashionable appearance Anne had once longed for so deeply. It was still the loveliest dress she had ever owned. Around her neck she fastened the little string of pearl beads Matthew had bought for her. The pearls rested softly against the white organdy. For a moment, Anne stood before the mirror, scarcely recognizing the tall young girl reflected there. The red hair she had once despaired over had deepened into a rich auburn. Her gray eyes seemed unusually bright, and the soft white dress made her look older somehow. Not grown up entirely, but no longer a child. And when she came downstairs, Matthew looked up. For several moments he simply gazed at her. "Well now," he said at last. Anne smiled. "Do I look presentable?" "You look real nice." Matthew's face brightened with quiet pride. Anne touched the pearls gently. "I feel beautiful tonight, Matthew." Then she laughed. "I hope it isn't terribly vain to say so." "I don't reckon it is." Anne slipped her arms around him. "The dress and the pearls are both perfect." Matthew smiled. He had never found it easy to say everything he felt, but Anne understood him anyway. Later that evening, Anne and Diana rode to White Sands with Jane Andrews and her brother Billy. The road wound through fields glowing beneath the last golden light of day. Diana wore a lovely sky blue dress, and Anne thought she had never seen her look prettier. "You look exactly like a piece of summer sky," Anne told her. "And you look like a princess," Diana replied. Anne laughed. "I'm afraid princesses are probably much calmer before public performances." At first the girls talked eagerly, but the nearer they came to White Sands, the quieter Anne became. Then the hotel appeared beyond the trees. Its broad verandas overlooked the water, and lanterns glowed softly beneath the eaves. Carriages filled the drive. Ladies in beautiful evening gowns moved beneath the lights. Gentlemen gathered in small groups along the veranda. Anne drew a small, slow breath. "Oh, Diana, isn't it beautiful?" "It is." Anne looked down at her white organdy gown. For once, she didn't feel plain or awkward. She and Diana were dressed as beautifully as anyone else could wish. Yet, the elegance surrounding them made the evening seem more important than ever. Inside, polished floors shone beneath the lamps. Flowers filled great vases along the hallway. Silk skirts rustled past. Everywhere Anne looked were people who seemed perfectly at ease in elegant rooms and fashionable company. She touched Matthew's pearls. "I'm beginning to feel nervous." "Oh, you'll be splendid," Diana assured her. "I really hope so." The concert room was already crowded. Rows of chairs faced a platform decorated with flowers and greenery. Anne and Diana found Jane and several other familiar faces among the performers. The sight of people from Avonlea helped a little. Then the concert began. A professional elocutionist performed first. She was tall and beautifully dressed, with a trained voice and graceful gestures. The audience applauded warmly. Anne listened with growing uneasiness. Next came a celebrated singer whose voice filled the room with effortless beauty. Then another polished performance followed. Each seemed grander than the one before. Anne's confidence slowly disappeared. She had felt proud of her own recitations in Avonlea, but here, surrounded by performers who had studied in great cities and appeared perfectly at home before fashionable audiences, she suddenly felt very young, very inexperienced, and very much like a country girl who had wandered into a far world larger than her own. "I wish I was back at Green Gables," she whispered. Diana reached for her hand. "You don't mean that." "At this moment, I truly do." "But you've recited before." "Not after listening to people like these." Anne looked toward the crowded room. "They know exactly what to do. They aren't frightened at all." "You don't know that." "They certainly don't look frightened." Diana squeezed her hand. "You'll be every bit as good." Anne smiled faintly. "You are the most loyal friend in the world." "And I'm right." Another round of applause filled the room. Then someone stepped onto the platform. Anne heard her name announced. For one terrible moment, every word she had practiced disappeared. Her hands grew cold. The room beyond the curtain seemed impossibly large. She thought of Green Gables, of Matthew's face when she had come downstairs in the beautiful white dress, of the pearl beads resting gently at her throat, of Diana waiting faithfully beside her. Anne lifted her head. The words were still there. She stepped toward the light. For one terrible moment, Anne stood beneath the bright lights and wished herself anywhere else in the world. The concert room seemed far larger from the platform than it had from behind the curtain. Rows upon rows of unfamiliar faces looked back at her. Ladies in beautiful gowns sat beneath the warm glow of the lamps. Gentlemen leaned forward in their chairs. Beyond the open windows, the summer night rested quietly over the sea. Anne could hear the faint rustle of silk, the gentle movement of a fan, a chair shifting somewhere near the back of the room. Then even those small sounds faded. Everyone was waiting. Anne's heart beat so quickly that she wondered whether the people in the front row could hear it. Every word of the recitation seemed to have vanished. Only moments before she had known exactly each line perfectly. Now, her mind felt empty. She looked across the audience helplessly. There was Diana, lovely in her sky blue dress, watching with complete faith in her eyes. There was Jane Andrews and several familiar faces from Avonlea, but even the sight of her friends could not quiet the dreadful fear that had taken hold of her. What if she couldn't begin? What if she stood there in silence before all of those fashionable strangers? What if she disgraced herself after everyone at home had been so proud of her? Then Anne saw Gilbert Blythe. He was sitting near the front, and he was smiling. Perhaps it was only a smile of encouragement. Perhaps Gilbert understood exactly how frightened she was and wished, in his own quiet way, to reassure her. But Anne did not see it that way. To her anxious mind, the smile looked triumphant, almost teasing, as though Gilbert had expected her to fail, as though he were waiting to see Anne Shirley lose her courage before the whole crowded room. Something within Anne changed. Her fear didn't disappear, but beneath it rose something older and stronger. Pride, determination. The familiar spirit that had carried her through years of rivalry at the Avonlea school. Gilbert Blythe would not see her fail. She would not stand helpless before him. She would not allow him to triumph over her. Anne lifted her head. The words returned. She drew one steady breath. Then she began. Her voice trembled slightly through the opening lines, but she continued. One line followed another. The familiar words gathered around her, and slowly the crowded concert began to disappear. Anne forgot the professional elocutionist. She forgot the fashionable hotelist. She forgot Gilbert Blythe. She forgot even to wonder whether anyone thought her young or inexperienced. The recitation itself became all that mattered. Anne had always possessed the rare ability to enter completely into a story. And when she imagined sorrow, she felt it. When she spoke of courage, something courageous rose within her. And when beauty lived inside a line, she could never merely repeat the words. She believed them. Her voice grew clearer. The nervousness that had followed her into the platform had slowly loosened its hold. In place of the crowded hotel came a world of the recitation. Anne moved through each passage with all the feeling and imagination she possessed. The audience grew still. A lady near the front lowered the fan that she had been moving idly only moments before. Several people who had been whispering turned their full attention toward the platform. Even those that had expected little more than a pleasant little performance from an Avonlea schoolgirl began to listen. Anne noticed none of it. She had forgotten herself entirely. By the final lines, her voice carried easily through the room. Then the recitation ended. For one brief moment, there was silence. Anne stood very still. Had she failed? Had she spoken too softly? Had the audience merely waited politely for her to finish? Then the applause began. It rose warmly through the room. Anne's cheeks flushed. She bowed and turned to leave the platform. But the applause continued. Someone called for an encore. Then another voice joined. Anne glanced uncertainly toward the side of the stage. The concert manager smiled and motioned for her to return. So Anne stepped forward once more. This time, the room no longer seemed quite so frightening. She gave a second selection, lighter than the first, but filled with the same warmth and expression. The audience laughed in all the proper places. When she finished, the applause came even more quickly. Anne bowed again, and as she left the platform, Diana hurried to meet her. "Oh, Anne," she caught both of Anne's hands. "You were wonderful." "Was I?" Anne's eyes were shining. "Truly?" "Everyone thought so." "I was certain I couldn't do it, but you did." Anne glanced toward the audience. I saw Gilbert smiling. Diana looked puzzled. "Gilbert?" "Yes." Anne lifted her chin. "I thought he was laughing at me, or expecting me to fail, and I decided then and there that I would not give him the satisfaction." Diana's eyes sparkled. "Perhaps he was only trying to encourage you." "Perhaps." Anne considered this. Then she smiled. "But I'm very glad I misunderstood him." The remainder of the concert passed in a happy blur. Anne listened to the other performers with new appreciation. The professional elocutionist no longer seemed like someone from an unreachable world. She was talented and graceful, certainly, but Anne no longer felt diminished beside her. She had discovered that there was room in the world for more than one kind of gift. When the final number ended, the audience drifted toward the broad hotel verandas. The night air was cool after the warmth of the crowded room. Lanterns swayed gently beneath the eaves. And beyond the lawns, the sea moved softly beneath the sky scattered with stars. Anne and Diana stood near the veranda railing, while groups of guests passed around them. Several stopped to congratulate Anne. A dignified gentleman told her that her recitation had been one of the finest parts of the evening. A lady in shimmering gown asked where she had studied. "At the Avonlea School," Anne answered. The lady seemed surprised. "Oh, you have a remarkable gift." "Thank you," Anne smiled. "My teacher, Miss Stacy, encouraged me a great deal." Then the professional elocutionist approached. Anne recognized her at once. Only a short time earlier, the woman's polished performance had made Anne feel very small and inexperienced. Now, she warmly smiled. "You recite beautifully," she told Anne. "You have something that cannot easily be taught." For once, Anne had no ready answer. "Thank you," she managed at last. The woman smiled and moved on. Anne watched her disappear into the crowd. "Diana? What is it?" "She said, I recite beautifully." "The professional elocutionist?" "Yes." Anne touched the pearl beads at her throat. "I think I shall remember that for the rest of my life." A little later, as the girls prepared to leave, Anne paused at the top of the hotel steps. The lanterns glowed behind her. Music and laughter drifted through the open doors. Beyond the lawn, the sea rested beneath the summer stars. Only a few hours earlier, she had entered the hotel feeling very small. Now, she understood something she had not known before. The larger world might be grand. It might be unfamiliar. It might even be frightening at first. But perhaps there was a place for Anne Shirley within it. And perhaps, when the time came, she would be brave enough to find it. September came quietly to Avonlea. The fields had begun to lose the deep green of summer, and here and there along the lanes a maple branch had turned crimson overnight. Goldenrod bloomed beside the fences. The evenings arrived a little earlier, and the air carried the faint promise of autumn. At Green Gables, preparations were underway. Anne was leaving for Queens. Her trunk stood open in the East Gable room while neatly folded dresses, freshly ironed shirtwaists, books, stockings, and carefully mended garments waited to be packed. Marilla approached the task with her usual practicality. She checked every seam, counted every handkerchief, insisted that Anne would need more warm stockings than Anne believed any person could possibly wear. "You'll be glad enough of them when the weather turns cold," Marilla said, placing another pair inside the trunk. "I'm sure I shall," Anne answered. She sat upon the edge of the bed, watching Marilla fold a woolen shawl. I believe I shall appreciate every single thing you have packed, even if I never use half of it." "You'd better use it." "I shall try," Anne smiled. "But I think knowing you folded everything will make it feel a little like carrying Green Gables with me." Marilla didn't answer. She bent over the trunk and carefully rearranged a stack of neatly folded garments that did not appear to need rearranging. For several moments, the room was quiet. Through the open window came the soft rustle of the Snow Queen's leaves. The old cherry tree had begun to turn, and a few yellow leaves drifted slowly past the glass. Anne looked around the little room beneath the eaves. How small it had seemed when she first came to Green Gables. How empty. How wonderful. She remembered standing at the window on the first evening, looking out at the blossoming cherry tree and imagining that its reflection belonged to a dear friend. Now, every corner held a memory. The narrow bed, the little table, the window overlooking the orchard. All of it had become part of her. "I don't believe I shall sleep very much tonight," Anne said. "You'd better." "I know," she sighed. "But there are so many things to remember." Marilla straightened. "You'll be home often enough." "Yes," Anne smiled. "But it won't be quite the same." "No." The answer came more softly than Anne had expected. Marilla turned toward the bed. "There's one more thing." She lifted a carefully wrapped parcel and placed it in Anne's lap. Anne looked surprised. "What is it?" "Open it and see." Anne untied the string. Inside lay a beautiful evening dress of soft pale green. For a moment, she only stared. The fabric was delicate and lovely, with graceful folds and carefully finished details. It was fashionable without being showy. Exactly the sort of dress Anne would have dreamed about for weeks. "Oh, Marilla." She lifted it gently. "Is it truly for me? Who else would it be for?" "But when did you—" "I had Mrs. Allan help me choose the pattern." Marilla spoke briskly, as though the matter were entirely ordinary. "You'll need a proper evening dress at Queen's. There may be concerts and gatherings, and I don't want you feeling different from the other girls." Anne looked from the dress to Marilla. Something warm rose in her throat. "You thought of all of that?" "Someone had to." Anne stood and held the pale green dress against herself. "It's beautiful." "I thought the color might suit you." "It does." Anne turned toward the small mirror. The soft green fabric brought out the warmth of her auburn hair. For a moment, she saw not the thin, freckled orphan who had arrived at Green Gables years before, but a tall woman preparing to step into a wider world. Then she caught Marilla watching her. There was an expression on Marilla's face Anne had rarely seen. Pride, tenderness, and something that looked almost like sadness. Anne lowered the dress. "What is it?" "Nothing." "It isn't nothing." Marilla sat down beside the open trunk. For a moment she smoothed one hand across the folded shawl. Then she said quietly, "I was wishing you could have stayed a little girl." Anne's eyes softened. "Oh, Marilla." "You've grown so fast." Marilla looked around the East Gable room. "It doesn't seem long ago that you came here, thin as a rail, talking from morning until night and getting into one scrape after another. I still talk a great deal. You do. And I dare say I'm not entirely beyond getting into scrapes." Marilla smiled faintly. "No, I suppose not." Anne sat beside her. "But I'm not really changed." "Aren't you?" "Oh, I've grown taller," Anne smiled. "And perhaps I'm a little wiser." "A good deal wiser." "And I don't use quite so many large words." "That is a blessing." They both laughed. Then Anne reached for Marilla's hand. "But the real me is still the same." Her voice softened. "I'm only just pruned down and branched out." Marilla looked at her. The things I've loved since I came to Green Gables, I love them more than ever. Anne glanced toward the open window. The trees, the brook, the lake of shining waters, Diana, and you and Matthew. She squeezed Marilla's hand. I will always be your Anne. Marilla looked away. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she cleared her throat. You'd better finish packing. Yes, Anne smiled through their bright eyes. I suppose I had. Downstairs, Matthew sat quietly near the kitchen door. When Anne came down wearing the pale green dress, he looked up. His face changed. Well now, he said softly. Anne turned slowly so he could see the dress. Marilla gave it to me. It looks real nice. Do you like it? I do. Anne crossed the room and kissed his cheek. Matthew smiled. Then, quite suddenly, he stood. I reckon I'd better go see to the cows. He reached for his hat and went outside. Anne watched the door close behind him. She did not see the tears in Matthew's eyes, but Marilla did. And for once, she said nothing at all. The morning of Anne's departure arrived clear and golden. A light mist rested over the low fields beyond Green Gables, and the orchard trees stood quietly beneath the pale September sky. Here and there, the maples along the lane had begun to show their first touches of crimson. Anne was awake before Marilla called her. For several moments, she lay beneath the familiar sloping roof of the east gable and listened. The old house was beginning to stir. A door opened softly downstairs. The kitchen stove was being lit. Outside, Matthew crossed the yard toward the barn, his footsteps following the same path they had followed on nearly every morning Anne could remember. Everything sounded ordinary, yet nothing felt ordinary at all. Today, Anne was leaving for Queens. Her trunk had been packed and fastened the night before. Her books were gathered. Her traveling dress hung neatly beside the bed. Anne rose and crossed to the window. The Snow Queen stood just beyond the glass, touched here and there with early autumn gold. Beyond the orchard lay the familiar fields, the brook, the little white bridge, and the distant glimpse of the lake of shining waters. Anne rested one hand against the window frame. I'm not saying goodbye, she whispered. Only until Friday. Still, when she turned away, her eyes were bright. Breakfast was quieter than usual. Marilla moved briskly between the table and the stove, reminding Anne of practical matters. You've enough money for what you'll need? Yes. And you know the way from the station to the boarding house? Yes. Miss Barry says the place is respectable. She does. The widow keeps a proper house, and you're not to be too shy to speak if there's anything you need. Anne smiled. I don't believe anyone has ever accused me of being too shy to speak. Matthew looked down at his plate. A faint smile crossed his face. Marilla ignored the remark. And write when you arrive. I will. You needn't write a book. I shall try to restrain myself. Marilla gave her a look. But I make no promises, Anne added. After breakfast, Matthew carried Anne's trunk to the buggy. Marilla checked the straps twice. Then she went back inside and returned with a parcel of food for the journey. You may not need it, she said, but you'd better take it. Anne accepted the parcel. Thank you. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Anne put her arms around Marilla. I'll be home before you have time to miss me. Marilla held her tightly. Only for a moment. Then she stepped back. You better get along. You don't want to miss the train. Anne turned toward Matthew. He stood beside the buggy with one hand resting upon the wheel. Well now, he said quietly. Anne smiled. Well now. She kissed his cheek. I'll write. You do that. And I'll study hard. I know you will. Matthew looked at her for a long moment. We'll be looking for you Friday. Anne climbed into the buggy, and as they drove down the lane, she turned and looked back. Marilla stood upon the porch. The morning light rested upon the white walls of Green Gables. The orchard spread quietly around it, and Anne waved. Marilla raised one hand. Then, the bend in the road hid the house from view. For the first few miles, Anne was unusually quiet. She watched the familiar places pass. The berry orchard, the old schoolhouse, the lane she and Diana had walked so many times. Each seemed more precious now that she was leaving it behind. But as the journey continued, anticipation slowly began to rise beside the sadness. Queens was waiting. New lessons, new teachers, new possibilities. By the time Anne reached town, excitement and homesickness had become so closely tangled that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Miss Barry had already arranged everything. A respectable boarding house that had been found near the academy, kept by a widow who had once been married to a British officer. The house stood upon a quiet street with easy walking distance of Queens. It was neat and comfortable, but it was not Green Gables. Anne noticed that immediately. Her room was small. There was a narrow bed beneath one wall, a washstand, a wooden chair, and a little desk beside the window. The curtains were plain. The walls held no familiar pictures. Outside the window were rooftops and chimneys instead of orchards and green fields. Anne set her traveling bag upon the bed. The room seemed very quiet. For the first time that day, she was entirely alone. She unpacked slowly. Marilla's careful work appeared everywhere. Each garment had been folded neatly. Every stocking had been mended. Between two shirtwaists, Anne found a small parcel of cakes wrapped in clean paper. She smiled. Oh, Marilla. At the bottom of the trunk lay the pale green evening dress. Anne touched the soft fabric. Then she thought of the evening before, of Marilla wishing she could have remained a little girl, of Matthew leaving the kitchen because his eyes were filled with tears. The room blurred. Anne sat upon the edge of the bed. For several minutes she had allowed herself to be homesick. She missed Green Gables. She missed the east gable. She missed the sound of Matthew moving quietly through the yard. She even missed Marilla reminding her not to leave books upon the stairs. The homesickness rose until Anne felt that one more thought of home would bring her to tears. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway. A moment later came a knock. Before Anne could answer, the door opened and Josie Pye appeared. "Well, Anne," she said, looking around the little room. "So this is where you are." Anne blinked quickly and turned away from the window. She hoped Josie had not noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I only just finished unpacking." Josie stepped inside and sat down upon the edge of the bed. "I'm nearly starved." Anne stared at her. "Starved?" "I haven't had anything worth eating since dinner. Did you bring any cake?" The question was so unexpected and so entirely like Josie that Anne almost laughed. "As a matter of fact, I did." She opened the parcel Marilla had tucked into her trunk and brought it out, the little cakes wrapped carefully in clean paper. Josie accepted one without hesitation. "Oh, these are good," she announced after her first bite. Anne smiled. "Marilla made them." For a few moments the room was quiet except for the soft rustle of paper and the distant sounds of the town beyond the window. Then Josie said, "Have you heard about the Avery Scholarship?" Anne looked up. "The what?" "The Avery Scholarship." Josie reached for another bite of cake. "They say there's a new scholarship this year. The student who makes the highest standing in English and English literature wins it." Anne sat a little straighter. "What does the scholarship provide?" $250 a year for 4 years at Redmond College." Anne stared at her. "Redmond?" "Yes." Josie spoke as though the matter were only mildly interesting. "I heard one of the girls talking about it downstairs." But Anne was no longer thinking of the little boarding house room. A door had opened suddenly in her imagination. Beyond Queens, beyond a teacher's license, lay Redmond College. Until that moment, Redmond had belonged to a distant future she scarcely dared to consider. College cost money. Anne knew too well how careful Matthew and Marilla had already planned and sacrificed for her education. But a scholarship might make the impossible possible. Her homesickness had not vanished. She still longed for Green Gables. She still wished she could hear Matthew crossing the yard and Marilla moving quietly through the kitchen. Yet beside the ache, something new had begun to grow. Hope. Ambition. A wider dream than any she had carried with her that morning. Before Anne could ask another question, voices sounded in the hallway. Then Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis appeared at the door. "Anne!" Ruby hurried inside. "We've been looking everywhere for you." Soon the little room was filled with familiar voices. Jane had news about the academy. Ruby was already worrying over lessons that had not yet begun. Josie continued eating Marilla's cake and offering opinions whenever the opportunity arose. For a little while, the boarding house felt less strange. Not like Green Gables. Nothing could be that. But perhaps it could become a place where Anne might learn to grow, a place where new hopes could take root. And outside, the lamps along the unfamiliar street began to glow. Tomorrow, Anne would walk through the doors of Queen's Academy. And now, beyond the first class license and the gold medal, another possibility awaited. Redmond College. Anne looked toward the darkening sky. Her world had grown larger once again. And somewhere, beyond the uncertainty of the coming year, a new dream had begun. The next morning, Anne awoke before the town was fully stirring. For one drowsy moment, she didn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar. No cherry branches softly brushing against the window. No early sunlight filtered through the leaves of the Snow Queen. Then, the sounds of the boarding house reached her. Footsteps moved along the hallway. A door opened and closed. Somewhere downstairs, dishes were being placed upon a table. And Anne remembered. She was in town. She was going to Queen's. She sat up quickly. Outside her window, rooftops and chimneys stood beneath a pale autumn sky. A light mist lingered on the streets, and the first wagons of the morning rattled over the road below. It was all very different from Avonlea, but today the difference felt less lonely. Today it felt like possibility. By the time Anne arrived at Queen's Academy, the halls were already filled with students. Girls stood together in small groups, exchanging names and wondering aloud which classes they would enter. Young men hurried past carrying books beneath their arms. Voices echoed along the corridors. Doors opened and closed. Everywhere there was movement. Anne felt very small among so many unfamiliar faces. At the Avonlea school, everyone had known her. They knew how she had once broken a slate over Gilbert Blythe's head. They remembered the liniment cake. They knew about the story club, the Lake of Shining Waters, and nearly every scrape Anne had ever found herself in. Here, she was simply one student among many. For a moment, that thought made her feel lonely. Then she saw Jane Andrews farther down the hall. Ruby Gillis stood beside her. Josie Pye was nearby, looking as though she had attended Queen's all her life and found nothing particularly impressive about it. Anne smiled. Familiar faces were comforting, even Josie's. Then she saw Gilbert Blythe. He stood near one classroom door, speaking with several other students. When he noticed Anne, he smiled. "Good morning, Anne." "Good morning, Gilbert." Their exchange was polite. Nothing more. Yet Anne was unexpectedly glad to see him. Gilbert belonged to Avonlea. He belonged to the old schoolhouse and the familiar road home. And although Anne would never have admitted it out loud, there was comfort in knowing that at least one person at Queen's understood exactly how hard she had worked to be there. Soon, the students were called together. The results from the entrance examinations would determine their class placement. Anne listened carefully as the names were read. She learned that she and Gilbert had both been placed in the first class. A thrill of satisfaction passed through her. The first-class course could be completed in 1 year. It would mean harder work, longer hours, more difficult examinations, but Anne had never been afraid of hard work. Gilbert glanced toward her. Anne met his eyes. For one brief moment, the old rivalry passed silently between them. Neither needed to speak. The race had begun again. Only now, there was more at stake. There was the first-class teacher's license, the gold medal, and beyond them, the Avery Scholarship. That afternoon, Anne learned more about it. The scholarship would be awarded to the student who achieved the highest standing in English and English literature, $250 a year for 4 years at Redmond College. Each detail seemed more wonderful than the last. Redmond had always belonged to the distant country of someday, a place Anne might dream about, but never expect to reach. Matthew and Marilla had already done so much. She could never ask them to bear the cost of college. But if she earned the Avery, Anne's imagination carried her forward. She pictured great libraries filled with books, lecture rooms, new ideas, a world of learning beyond anything she had yet known. Then she reminded herself that scholarships were not won through imagination alone. They would be hard work, a great deal of it, and Gilbert Blythe would be working too. By the end of the first week, Queen's had begun to settle into a rhythm. Lessons filled the days, evenings were devoted to study, and the work was more demanding than anything Anne had known in Avonlea. Yet, she loved it. There was pleasure in opening a difficult book and slowly discovering that she could understand it. There was satisfaction in mastering a lesson that had seemed impossible only hours before. And there was Gilbert. Again and again their names appeared near one another. If Anne stood first in English, Gilbert led in mathematics. If Gilbert earned the highest mark in one subject, Anne quietly resolved to surpass him in the next. Neither spoke of the rivalry. They didn't need to. It lived in exchanged glances, in carefully prepared lessons, in the silent determination with which each approached every new challenge. Yet, something about the rivalry had changed. It no longer felt bitter. Anne did not wish Gilbert to fail. She simply wished to succeed. And perhaps, though she would not have admitted it even to herself, she was glad he was there. On Friday afternoon, Anne returned to Green Gables. The moment she stepped down from the buggy, the familiar world seemed to gather around her. The orchard, the fields, the soft murmur of the brook. Matthew came from the barn to meet her. Marilla stood in the doorway. "Well," Marilla said, "how was your first week?" Anne looked from one beloved face to the other. Then she smiled. "Oh, Marilla, I have enough to tell you to last until Monday morning." I expected as much. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Supper waited upon the table. Anne slipped into her familiar chair and began telling them everything. The boarding house, her classes, the first-class course, the gold medal, and finally, the Avery Scholarship. "Redmond College," Anne said softly. The words still sounded almost too beautiful to be real. Matthew looked at her. "You'd like to go?" "Oh, Matthew," Anne's eyes shone, "more than I can say." "Then I reckon you'd better win that scholarship." Anne smiled. "I mean to try." Later that evening, she climbed the stairs to the east gable. Her room welcomed her exactly as she had left it. Moonlight rested across the floor. The branches of the Snow Queen moved gently beyond the window. Anne sat beside the glass and looked out over the quiet fields. Only 1 week had passed, yet already the world seemed wider. Queens waited beyond the road. Redmond waited somewhere beyond Queens. And all around her stood Green Gables, steady, familiar, home. Anne rested her head against the window frame. She didn't know what the coming year would bring, but there would be new lessons ahead, new dreams, new roads waiting to be followed, and for the first time, the future didn't seem like something far away. It had already begun. And now, Avonlea grows quiet once more. The last golden light rests softly upon the fields, warming the tops of the grasses and touching the first crimson leaves along the winding red roads. Beyond the orchard, the little white schoolhouse stands peacefully beneath the trees. Its windows have grown dark. Its lessons are finished, and the paths that once carried familiar footsteps lie empty in the gathering dusk. Near Green Gables, the brook moves gently beyond the little bridge. carrying fallen leaves slowly over the water. The orchards are still, the garden rests, and from the farmhouse chimney a thin ribbon of smoke rises into the cooling evening air. Inside, the lamps have been lit. Their warm glow spills softly across the porch and shines through the windows toward the quiet fields beyond. Soon, the last birds settle among the branches, and the shadows deepen beneath the trees. And one by one, the small sounds of the day begin to fade. Perhaps for a little while, you can imagine yourself there too, following the quiet road toward Green Gables, beneath an early autumn sky. The evening air is cool. The farmhouse windows are glowing, and there is nothing waiting for you now, except warmth, stillness, and rest. So let the quiet evolve and lease around you. Let the day grow distant. There is nowhere left to be, nothing left to do, only rest. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. You have been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.